Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll get a chance to take a look at the Stonewall Dutch, a formation for black arising out of the Dutch defense, which begins with the moves pawn to d4 and pawn to f5. With the move pawn to f5, black takes control over the e4 square and limits the mobility of white's king's pawn. In the Stonewall formation, black will later augment his control over the e4 square by including the move d7 to d5. We'll get a chance today to look at many interesting setups for white, as well as some important subtleties in the Stonewall. Let's take a look. The Stonewall Dutch is most often reached after white opens with the move pawn to d4. With this move, white aims to begin claiming central space and to offer scope to his queen and to his bishop. And now, if black plays the move pawn to f5, we have the Dutch defense. There are many ways black can play the Dutch defense, but in the Stonewall Dutch, the subject of this video, black is going to carry this philosophy of gripping the e4 square forward with all of his might into the middle game. White's most popular move in this position is the simple move pawn to g3, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to g2. But I think it's important to stop and consider the various options for white in this position to gain an appreciation of why white often plays the move g2 to g3 in this position. An aggressive option against the Dutch is to go ahead and play the move e2 to e4 anyway, known as the Staunton Gambit. With the Staunton Gambit, white aims to break down as quickly as possible the f-pawn and often is able to regain the pawn. However, the Staunton Gambit does not have a very good reputation, as there are known methods for black to neutralize it. Instead, more common sidelines for white involve the possibility of bringing out the dark squared bishop as quickly as possible. One way to go about this is to simply play the move bishop to g5, aiming to interfere with some of black's development as the e-pawn is pinned, and if the knight comes out to f6, white has the possibility of inflicting doubled pawns onto the position with bishop takes f6, and for example, e takes f6. In the Dutch, since black's pawn has already moved to f5, there's a little bit more of a vulnerability for black here. If the pawn were still on f7, this would not be such a big deal, these doubled pawns, but in this position, the pawn on f5 ends up being a little bit more vulnerable. Another example of the same idea and another line in the same spirit is to simply play knight to c3, threatening e2 to e4. And now after black plays knight f6, defending the square, once again, white can look for the idea of bishop to g5, attacking the knight on f6 and threatening to create doubled pawns. And now if black simply plays e6, defending against that possibility of doubled pawns, it is known that white gets an advantage with the move pawn to e4, and theory shows that this is very comfortable for white. So instead of playing e6, defending the knight on f6, black instead plays the move pawn to d5, defending the e4 square. And at this moment, again, white has a pleasant idea of bishop takes f6, and after e takes f6, white can look for long-term play based on the vulnerability of the pawn on f5. So the concept of utilizing the bishop on g5, often capturing on f6, is a fair strategy which white sometimes uses. But time has revealed that white has even better chances if he can reserve the dark squared bishop and instead aim to trade it with black's dark squared bishop. This is quite logical, since in the Dutch, black's pawns often end up on light squares, leaving the dark squares vulnerable. We'll see very instructive examples of this throughout today's video. The final move I'd like to briefly mention is the possibility of simply playing knight to f3. But for reasons we'll see in a moment, I think this is a very subtle mistake. I'll also build a case for this at a later point in the video. Finally, we return to white's most popular strategy, which is simply the move pawn to g3, preparing to fianchetto the light squared bishop. White can also play the move pawn to c4 first, as this does not give black any significant options, and then play the move pawn to g3. With g3, white is choosing the most logical method of developing the bishop, since other methods are not so feasible. After the moves knight f6 and bishop g2, in many variations of the Dutch, this light squared bishop ends up being quite a beast, bearing down on the long diagonal, complicating black's development and adding some pressure and coordinating with the queenside attack at a later phase in the game. At this point, black has two options about how to proceed. He may choose the move pawn to g6 or the move pawn to e6, and both of these moves address the question of how to deploy the dark squared bishop. Today, we will look at the move pawn to e6, as this is the move which allows black to play for the stonewall variation. Now white has two options once again. He can simply deploy the knight to f3 and castle kingside and then look for an active plan, or he may first play the move pawn to c4, gaining some more queenside space and a little bit more central influence. Let's assume that once again white is going to postpone the deployment of his knight and he's simply going to choose c4 for the time being. And now, if black plays d5, we have arrived at the stonewall variation. Black's plan is to complete his stonewall formation with the move pawn to c6, and this is the four-pawn formation which is known as the stonewall. Then, black is looking to complete his deployment fluidly with the moves bishop d6, castling kingside, and only then to look for an active plan. In the meantime, he hopes to keep white restrained in the center using this massive formation of pawns. Backing up to the position after pawn to d5, the most important drawback of black's plan has to do with the vulnerable e5 square. Because black has moved both his d-pawns and f-pawns forward 2 squares, the e5 square can never again be protected by a pawn. As the game wears on, white is often able to occupy this square with a knight, and then use this knight's advanced placement as an important asset in the ensuing positional struggle. Now, here is the big surprise in the Stonewall Dutch. In this position, white actually has a choice between deploying the knight on f3 and deploying the knight on h3. And it turns out that a close look at practical results, as well as a close study of what's going on in the position, reveals that the correct square for the knight may be h3. This is a very, very clever idea by white, which takes into account the long-ranging plans in the position. The simple idea behind knight h3 is that once the bishop comes to d6, white has the opportunity to play bishop f4, a square which is supported by the knight on h3. As we've discovered earlier, the dark squared bishops are going to be very important strategic pieces here, as black has just gone out of his way to constellate his pawns on light squares, and therefore this exchange of dark squared bishops comes as very bad news for black. Let us briefly examine some of the issues that arise if white plays knight to f3, which is actually a bit more popular, but in my opinion, slightly less efficient for white. After the moves knight f3, c6, black has achieved his stonewall formation. Black is ready to complete the deployment of his bishop and castle. His long-term strategic concept is that his barrier of pawns in the center will hold up long enough to ensure him time to get his pieces out and cooperating. Then he may even have an advantage, since he has a well-supported advanced pawn on f5 that could give him extra space and an attack on the king side. Play now continues castling kingside, and now black has to decide where to deploy his king's bishop. The d6 square is natural, and it's quite important that black select this move, as we'll see in just a moment. In the long term, the bishop on d6 will be important in adding some influence over the e5 square. If white's knight were on h3 instead of f3, white could easily prepare the move bishop to f4 in this position without worrying about getting a damaged pawn structure. Basically, all I'm saying here is that if the knight had deployed itself to h3 at an earlier stage, white would now be ready to play bishop f4, as that square would be defended. Now, by far, white's most popular move in this position is the move pawn to b3, aiming to achieve the same bishop exchange with the move bishop to a3. But here, another important benefit of placing the bishop on d6 is revealed. Black now has an opportunity to play the move queen to e7, ruling out the bishop to a3 exchange for quite some time, and at the same time the queen and bishop work together very nicely in this position to help restrain some of the movement of white's queenside pawns. In particular, white will lose the opportunity to play b4 at the right moment. Black often couples this idea of bringing the queen to e7 and the bishop to d6 with a later move, pawn to a5, to really make sure that these pawns cannot get rolling, and this hinders white in the middle game. Most commonly, white now plays the move bishop to b2 and continues rolling his game forward. But white's bishop on b2 often turns out to be clumsily placed, since white would rather have space on the queen side to deploy his rooks and knights while expanding the pawns forward. For example, he'd like this bishop to not be on b2, and he'd like to be able to bring rooks to maybe c1 and b1, and to be advancing these pawns forward. Whereas with the bishop on b2, white will have this bishop in the way. This is yet another reason why white likes to trade bishops early. He just doesn't have that much else to do with the dark squared bishop that fits realistically into his overall scheme. With all of these points in mind, it appears that black has nearly managed to balance the game, as black tends to find that he has plenty of time to complete his development, while white's play develops rather slowly here. And remember, after black gets his pieces out, he may even find himself a little bit better thanks to his extra space on the king side. It's not uncommon to see black generating more initiative in this area of the board after getting his pieces out. For example, sometimes simply playing g7 to g5, even if he's castled on the king side, beginning to look for a king side attack. Having understood all of this, we're in a much better position to understand why white plays the move knight to h3 as an alternative to knight f3. With knight h3, white is simply preparing bishop f4, getting ready to exchange the dark squared bishops, and at the same time, he avoids the issues associated with the battery of bishop on d6, queen to e7, which complicated the queenside play. Interestingly, the move knight h3 has been known for as long as the Stonewall formation has been known, and the great masters of the past were aware of this move and played it frequently. However, knight f3 has always been a little bit more popular, most likely due to the apparent naturalness of the move. Here, play proceeds similar to before with the move pawn to c6, white castles kingside, and then once again, black has a choice of where to deploy his bishop. Now, if black knows that white has positioned his knight on h3, with the main idea of supporting a bishop exchange on f4, why doesn't he just position the bishop with bishop to e7? In fact, this is a move, but forcing the bishop to adopt this post would already be a victory for white, since the bishop is not posted on its most active location on d6. One effect of this is that white has an easier time dominating the e5 square over the next several moves. An attractive and instructive way for white to proceed, based entirely on this idea, is knight to d2, castling kingside, queen to c2, shoring up the c4 pawn because we're getting ready to move the d2 knight again in just a moment. And now the typical plan here is to play knight to f4 to d3, so that this knight is contacting the e5 square, and then also knight to f3, so that the other knight is involved in controlling the e5 square, and then follow this with a timely invasion of the e5 square by one of the knights, and begin rolling these pawns forward, rook a b1 and b4 b5. This is the typical plan in this position. And in this position, this is a big improvement over having the bishop on b2, since white will find it very easy to get his pieces cooperating, and with the bishop stuck on e7, as opposed to d6, what black will tend to find is that he will miss opportunities to have extra control over the e5 square, and this is a highly interesting position for study. So in fact, most players do not play bishop e7, they actually play bishop to d6, knowing that the bishop is going to bring itself out to f4, and this is in fact what white plays instantly, the move bishop to f4. Now, one interesting idea for black is to now drop the bishop back to e7. The idea here is that white's knight will need to access the f4 square sooner or later, just as we saw before, in order to pivot to the d3 square and influence the game by controlling e5. By allowing white's bishop f4 move, black hopes to show that the knight on h3 is somehow misplaced. If white repositions his bishop, then he winds up losing a tempo, since wherever white repositions the bishop, it will have a harder time gaining an attractive position along any given diagonal. So what can white do? Well, in this position, he simply continues with knight d2, a very similar plan as before. Black castles kingside, and once again, white plays queen c2, shoring up the pawn on c4, and the intention is to bring the knight to f3. Now, at this point, black's development is a little bit more complicated than it at first appears. Black's most natural plan is to continue expanding on the king side, taking advantage of his extra space with the move h6 and g5. And the other reason why this is such an interesting plan for black here is that this aims to exploit the somewhat confused placement of the knight and the bishop at the current moment. But white simply plays now bishop takes b8, just getting the bishop right out of the way. Rook takes b8, and now white uses the opportunity to pivot the knight on the f4 square, knight f4, leading to a favorable position. Once again, white is going to follow the aggressive strategy of just piling pieces, piling knights in particular, up on the e5 square. Now, it's important to point out that black has gained the bishop, the dark squared bishop, at the cost of a knight instead of a bishop in this position, and at the cost of an undeveloped knight. But white still has some advantages here and is able to control the e5 square. And in this position, in this close position, it may even turn out that the knights are worth more than the bishop. As we saw earlier, the dark squared bishop was usually a problem piece for white anyhow. Often play continues bishop d6, and now white can again play knight d3 with the idea of knight f3, leading to some advantage. Or another approach in this position is actually knight to g6, and after rook e8, bringing the other knight to f3, and either knight can come to e5, once again leading to an advantage for white. Backing up to the position just before h6, you may wonder why black doesn't just eliminate the option of the exchange on bishop takes b8 simply by moving the knight. However, if black tries knight b to d7, white is able to demonstrate another unique benefit to the placement of the knight on h3. He can play knight to g5, striking at the e6 pawn. And amusingly, the e6 pawn is not so easy to defend. For example, if black plays knight to b6, white simply strikes with c5 and black will lose material anyhow. So in this position, the knight would have to retreat back to b8, and after the move knight g to f3, white simply repositions his knight to f3 since it has completed its job on h3. And there is now further control over the e5 square. If instead, black tries the same idea, knight a6, trying to get rid of this exchange, and white plays a3, now after the move h6, it is simply known that after bishop e5, white continues to have some advantage in this position. We haven't even come close to exhausting every option for both sides in this very interesting formation, but I hope that you found this brief survey instructive and enjoyable. We've managed to understand many important subtleties and many important strategies in the Stonewall, and I hope that you've gained insight into this exciting formation for both sides. That's all for today, and we'll see you soon.